Hello to everyone who's tuned in. Welcome to today's webinar titled Creating a Content Framework for Personalization, brought to you by Sitecore. This is the fifth in a series we've been running called Digital Transformation in Asia. The previous four covered a digital transformation framework, building a digital marketing strategy, the importance of cross-team collaboration, and how to design a digital customer experience for Asia. They're all available on demand on the Sitecore website. And you will receive an email with the link to it soon after. My name is Upali Dasgupta. I'm the Marketing Director for Asia at Sitecore, and I'll be your host for today's session. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker for today's webinar. I'm joined by George Smith, Digital Strategist and Regional Managing Director at Horizontal. Welcome, George.
Thanks, Upali. I'm pleased to be here.
A little bit about George. He's a Sitecore MVP who has worked on digital strategy in Asia for over 5 years and in the Middle East for 4 years and in Europe as well for 12 years. As a former local politician, he has written a book on how digital technology is impacting government. If you've watched our previous webinars, you're probably already well acquainted with what Sitecore does, but this is a brief introduction for those of you who are joining us for the first time. Sitecore is a digital experience platform, and we work with both B2B and B2C brands to deliver digital experiences. We do this by providing a platform that enables brands to build, manage, and deliver personalized content, drive online sales, capture and act on customer behavior insights to deliver relevant personalized experiences. Sitecore started in 2001, and we have more than 5,200 brands globally using our platform. We operate in over 50 countries and have brands like L'Oreal, Philippines Airlines, and Toyota using us in the Asia Pacific. We also have a huge ecosystem of partners, which include agencies and system integrators, and we're lucky to be joined by one of our key partners, Horizontal, for today's webinar. Here's a quick snapshot of our customer base from around the world and in Asia Pacific. Before we jump into today's topic, I'm going to do a quick recap of what we've covered in the series so far. We kicked off the series with our guest speaker from IDC, sharing a digital determination blueprint that highlights the key drivers of success for digital transformation. These are having a single unified strategy across all departments that are involved in digital initiatives, defining financials or metrics that capture real business value like revenue, cost, deploying a platform that can be integrated across an enterprise's tech stack, and finally, creating an organizational structure and culture that encourages cross-team collaboration. We've seen through our research and other third-party research that most organizations have invested in digital and marketing technology in some form. So in order to build a more holistic digital strategy, an obvious starting point would be to take stock of where you're at and evaluate where you need to get to. And that's what we explored in our second webinar. We looked at a digital transformation diagnostic tool that Ogilvy Consulting uses to diagnose the digital maturity of an organization by evaluating a whole range of parameters. And what this tool shows is that digitally less mature companies often function in silos, and this is often reflective of how digital investment happens in that organization. So in many cases, it happens in a fractured, project-based way, and that's one of the biggest reasons that digital initiatives fail. And so in our third webinar, we heard from 3 of Sitecore's customers and partners who are running successful digital initiatives on how they're collaborating across teams and building a unified approach to delivering a seamless digital customer experience. In the fourth and the webinar just before this, we looked at the building blocks of a digital customer experience strategy, which starts with understanding your customers, doing a gap analysis on how to serve them, and paying attention to detail for every touch point to deliver a consistent experience. Which brings us to today's topic, where we will be looking at the role of content in delivering that consistent personalized experience. Over to you, George.
Thanks, Upali. So I'll just take over the screen, and hopefully soon you will see the opening slide for exactly that, for content frameworks for personalization. And I really want to not repeat anything that's been delivered in the other excellent webinars that have come before, and really, but set it in that context, and really talk about the role of content and how it impacts personalization strategy, and how business can move forward with that. And what we've got is three simple parts to the agenda here. So first of all, just set in that context, I'm going to just talk about the change in role of content in customer experience, just so everyone understands the sort of the backdrop for how content has changed. And that gives rise, and is logically, to the second section here, which is defining the problem. What is the problem that content frameworks are attempting to solve? And really sort of digging into that and framing that. And I hope that for much of the audience, that problem will they'll have a lot of empathy with that challenge. And then finally, in the third section, I just want to get really practical and talk about, okay, so how do you build a content framework? And how do you make that useful for enacting a content strategy and for personalization across your digital properties? So let's look first at that first piece. Content has always played an important role in marketing and sales and across the business. But what I really want to do is just overview the way in which content has changed in relationship to customer experience, especially since the advent of digital. So as a simple heuristic for our conversation, I just want to talk a little bit about the customer journey. So obviously, most organizations will attempt to define their customer journey now in terms of the customer's user needs. But for consistency with the past, I just want to overview a very simple customer journey across three internal business functions: marketing, sales, and customer service. Essentially, every business for many years now, you have a marketing department which attempts to create awareness. You have a sales department that attempts to persuade customers to purchase. Then you have an after-sales customer service cross-sell type function for those existing customers. And if we take each of them in turn and talk about the role of content and how it's changed, if we turn first to marketing, marketing is traditionally quite a simple sort of objective. You identify your target audience and you say, right, these are my target audience. These are the people whose eyeballs I really need. And I'm just going to find out what they're looking at or find out where they are. And I'm just simply going to plaster my logo next to the thing they're looking at. So if that's in a magazine or in a newspaper, you simply find the newspaper that your target audience like, and you advertise it. If that is, for example, on TV, you would find a sporting event like the Super Bowl, and you will buy an expensive halftime commercial because you are literally placing your logo in the very next to the piece of content, if you like, that they're actually there to see. And similarly, in physical space, you identify the sort of the high street that the customer will traditionally be walking down, and then you plaster your logo where they're going to come across it. And so really, traditional marketing is defined in large part by the strength and size of your media spend, literally how much of that advertising space you can buy next to the thing the customer really wants to look at. But of course, the trouble with digital and the way digital has changed this is that that's just not really so much an option anymore. I mean, now people have so many more options for content, and they're actually digesting that content on a screen which is personalized for them, often too small for adverts. If they're looking for TV, people don't watch TV channels anymore. They will curate their own content, and they'll watch it through streaming and Netflix, and they'll watch it on a phone or an iPad. And so you don't own that space. It's not just a case of fast forwarding through adverts. The concept of the advert and the channel just doesn't really exist anymore. And we all know that people aren't going to the high street anymore. And not just because of our current pandemic, but just as a trend. And so the customer is taking more and more control of the content, and taking more and more control of the interfaces that produce that content, and making it harder and harder for an advertiser just to put their logo next to that content. So really the only opportunity left for marketing departments is not to place their logo next to interesting content, but to create the interesting content, create the content that actually the user, the target audience, want to engage with. And so we have this role of marketing where the size of the media spend is less and less important, and the ability to create engaging content for your target audience is far more important. But it doesn't just stop at awareness and doesn't just stop at marketing. It's also the role of sales. I mean, again, we see a similar trend of the customer taking control. So if you just think about your local grocery store or supermarket, many years ago, it starts with a counter, and no customer going into the store can ever touch the products or can ever sort of choose the products off the shelf. The shopkeeper is in complete control over the conversation and the purchase. That you will say, I want a pound of flour, I want a bag of apples, and the storekeeper can choose the ones they want, can recommend other products. They're in complete control. And that moves away from that sort of counter. The counter disappears to stores that we're all familiar with, where you get a trolley and you can interact with the products. And it becomes a bit harder to sort of persuade, and becomes a bit harder to have a sort of a conversation with the customers attempting to choose their product. And now, of course, on the right here, we're in a situation where customers aren't even going into the store, right? So, and customers are shopping at multiple stores all at the same time, and they're curating off different platforms. The ability to have a conversation with a customer and persuade them in that sort of sales context is increasingly more difficult. And really, in digital senses at least, and often even in physical spaces, the only way we can really persuade the customer is in content, is in the types of content we can present to that customer at that right time, at that point of truth. And it's becoming increasingly difficult. And so the role of content becomes increasingly important. And similarly, finally, in that sort of third, large area of the business, once someone is a customer, overwhelmingly now the business models exist around digital content that allows people to, for example, self-serve. If you can allow someone to efficiently manage their own account, make their own investments, purchase other products, be engaging content that persuades them to cross-sell to other areas, or indeed actually the content can be the very product itself that you are selling. Increasingly, again, the importance of content in the context of customer service is that much more apparent. And content is at the heart of most business models, either as the product or in persuading customers to purchase, to upsell, to provide reference, to strip out a lot of the costs of the business, and ultimately also impact the top line. So content across the board, across marketing, across sales, and across sort of customer service and business functions is increasingly important. And it's in that context that we are talking about today. That increasing role of content engagement leaves us with numerous challenges for the modern business. And I want to focus very specifically on one of them that content framework solved. So what is the problem that we are trying to solve here? What is the challenge that changing role of content has created? So I want to talk about a metaphor of planning a date, planning a romantic date, because at some level, the goal of many businesses will be to create personalized content to exactly the right user. This is essentially a matchmaking opportunity. What we're saying is, look, if we know who the right customer is, and we know what they want, and we know where they are and what stage of the funnel they're at, then actually, if we provide them that right piece of the content at that right moment, in the place they expect to find it, then we have a better opportunity to nudge their behavior, to get them to buy, to get them to renew, to get them to self-serve, whatever it might be. It is a matchmaking between the customer and the right piece of content for them. And if you imagine a different type of matchmaking, a sort of a plan and a date, if you were to plan a great first date, there's lots of things you will need to plan, right? You need to arrange for a taxi, you need to sort of buy some new clothes, choose a great restaurant, prepare a whole load of small talk for sort of the awkward moments at the beginning, maybe buy some flowers, whatever it might be. But you can plan all of that out, but it would be very remiss of you if you planned all of that out and you forgot to choose the right partner for the date. And I think actually this analogy is true of what I see again and again on people who are, for example, building a website. They will spend a lot of time planning many of the important aspects of that site and yet often forget about content. So to put it in a slightly different way, if you were architecting a building, a physical building, you would look at many different architectural views of that building. Um, you would, for example, look at the physical foundations, that architecture, but you'd also look at interior design. Someone else would come in with a view of the safety of that building, fire exits, etc. Someone else would come in and look at the air conditioning structure of that building. Someone else would architect it to be relevant to the wider town planning or the environmental impact. There are multiple, if you like, architectural views that will be taken from different parties with different perspectives on the building, and they will all come together, and those views will inform each other and be informed by the other views. And something similar kind of happens really when you're thinking about architecting a website or an app or any digital property. We have many architectural views that we will look at. So, for example, technical architecture would be a common term where people will look at, for example, logical architecture of how systems join together and integrate, and that's a common view that we will take early in the look at the website. Similarly, service design is a type of architecture of the whole customer journey. We Service design blueprinting is an incredibly powerful tool to put the whole customer journey on one page, articulating the user needs and understanding how we orchestrate an experience around those user needs. Similarly, brand architecture, not just for websites, but brand architecture, brand guidelines. We'll look at what does that brand mean and how does that actually convey to the look and the feel of the site. Similarly, UX architecture, we'll look at the sort of detail of how things are presented and how things flow. And increasingly on more data-heavy projects, we're also now looking at data architecture and saying, okay, so where does that data sit? How is it used? How does that actually influence the site? But one thing that really kind of often gets missed is content architecture. How often, for the audience out there, I mean, how often, if you are involved in, for example, creating a website, do you spend as much time thinking about the architecture of the content? I don't mean the copywriting, and I don't mean the sort of the skill of the copywriter, I mean literally, how often will you think about what content do we need, where does it need to be, how are we going to use it? How often do people think about the architecture of that content as much as they think, for example, about the technical architecture? How often is that a deliverable, an asset that gets approved and signed off? In my experience, often it's missing. Often it's something that people, they will plan the technical architecture and the brand and the UX, etc. In the same way they might plan the taxi and the restaurant and the flowers, but they forget the date. They forget that fundamentally this is a matchmaking between an individual and their user needs and a piece of content that will service those needs, that will persuade, and that will move them along the journey. And so I actually personally don't like the term content architecture or content framework because even though it's relatively common, I think people, when they hear it, they think about actually something akin to copywriting or typesetting a piece of content. And I think it also doesn't hit quite at the core of what we're trying to achieve. So my personal preference is to use the term personalization architecture. And what we at Horizontal will always advocate is, yes, we'll create a content architecture for you. We'll create a brand architecture, obviously service design blueprinting. All of that is great. But have we really thought through personalization architecture? And should we be surprised that if at the end of our project, if you haven't thought through how personalization will work, and that hasn't influenced all of the other views of your website, then should you be surprised if you turn on your site and personalization doesn't happen? I mean, that feels the same way as if you don't plan out your technology. Should you be surprised if without technical architecture, funnily enough, the technology doesn't work? I mean, it's the same thing. We need to plan for personalization. It is an important view, just the same way as if you ignore interior design of a building, don't be surprised if it doesn't look right. You have to have a personalization architecture. And that is really specifically what we're talking about today. The nature of content has changed. Digital has greatly influenced the importance and the nature of the content we need to produce at all stages of the customer experience. And that leads to an importance to take content strategically, to plan out the architecture of that content. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about what that would look like now. It's particularly relevant to one of the previous webinars that discussed the importance of breaking down silos, because no, in today's world, the customer is not owned by a department. The customer is not owned by marketing. It's not owned by IT. It's not owned by product. It's owned by everyone. And we need to break down those silos within a business and to not think about the business as a set of um, production work stops, but think about it as one unified tool for orchestrating a customer experience that persuades the customer to behave in the way we want to behave. And that, of course, includes all of those different views. The technology department will come with a tech architecture, like the brand department will come with a brand architecture, etc. Someone, most often, that person will be as part of the content function, wherever that sits in your business. Someone needs to be responsible for the personalization architecture and thinking that through. What I want to talk to you about as a way of defining that personalization architecture is how it will relate to those other 5 architectural views I've talked about. So, first of all, I want to talk about, well, how will it influence the technical architecture and how will it be influenced by the technical architecture? So, how does this content person relate to the technology folk? I mean, the thing I really want to stress here is for the more technical amongst you in the audience, you'll be familiar with the concept of emergent architecture, which has really evolved amongst technical architects recently. So, without getting too technical, it essentially says that you don't need to architect everything in the technology perfectly, cross every T or dot every I. What you need to do is you need to allow that technology to wear in, not wear out. And you need it to actually strengthen through questioning, through testing, through learning, and it will deepen over time and emerge. So, and a similar sort of resonance, I think, should also be applied to the way we tackle personalization architecture or the way we think about content. Because, there's so much content. If you think about what your website will look like in 5 years when it's really working, when it's incredibly personalized, well, actually, there'll just be a cornucopia of content, an unimaginable amount of content. It's very nuanced, very specific, tried and tested over time. You, of course, can't plan all of that out. But what you can do is start from simple beginnings that are executable, that are meaningful, that are valuable from day one, and use that as a content laboratory to test hypotheses about what content works, with which audience, etc. So a simple way to structure that and think about, well, what is the content we need for go live, and then how do we emerge from there? So my recommendation would always just choose 2 main variables that you think are going to best correlate with personalization for go live. So you might want to take, for example, personas on one side. So here, for example, I've thought about 3 personas for an imaginary asset manager. Could be, of course, whoever your personas are in whatever industry. And then I've also, just for illustrative purposes, just said, well, I think probably if I know both what type of persona they are and the type of asset class they want to invest in, that will probably be the best way of giving them some marketing content. This, of course, could be industry rather than asset class. It could be net worth. It could be geography. It could be whatever it is that you think in your build in your business best correlates to the way users engage with content, the way they search, the kind of needs and questions they have at that early sort of marketing phase. And then it's really just as simple as saying, well, do I have a piece of content for each one of those areas? So if I build a great website and a great customer experience and so a platform like Sitecore has essentially a real-time probability engine in it that will say, look, we can determine in real time the likelihood that this customer visiting your site is persona A or persona B, that they are either a high net worth retail investor or they are a broker. And once you've identified that, it will also help you understand, well, what is the type of asset class they are most interested in, and it will, at that point, it is the huge opportunity to present that visitor with a piece of content that says, hey, if you are a high net worth individual interested in FX, interested in foreign currencies, here's a piece of content that's incredibly relevant to you. And To go back to the date analogy, you just need to make sure you have that piece of content. That piece of content might not necessarily be perfect, but it will be your best guess at the moment, your best hypothesis as to what piece of content will persuade that high net worth investor interested in FX to take the next action, to purchase, to sign up, whatever it might be. And just thinking through, making sure you literally have content in each of these different areas, these very simple metrics, is often enough for go live. It's often enough to start developing from. And what it also forces you to do, of course, in terms of marketing automation, is to say, well, how do each one of these pieces of content, what happens next to them? And so if you're using market automation within Sitecore, you'll be able to say, okay, right, well, what is the next step we want that person to take? And if they don't take it, how are we going to nudge them with emails, with messaging next time they come, etc. So just thinking through that and how that relates to sort of the emergent properties of not trying to overthink it from day one. But I also want to really crucially call out how this will relate to design and how content should relate to the service design blueprint and our architecture that's been done, that really views the whole customer experience. If we were to think about service design, for example, for recruitment, Horizontal was lucky enough to be awarded a Sitecore Experience Award last year for a recruitment process, often a much missed part of the customer journey to a site. But let's say there's 4 simple stages to that recruitment journey. What we are effectively trying to do is to orchestrate a conversation. The fact that it's a website, let's ignore. Let's think about it as a conversation between the customer with certain needs and the brand with a business to run. What does that conversation look like? Obviously, first of all, we start saying, well, what are the needs, the user needs? What does that customer need at that stage? For example, they may say, well, look, if I'm a job seeker, I'm coming to your site, what I really want is personalized job ads that understand who I am and try and promote the best job ads that I'm most likely to be interested in. For example, the location I'm visiting from, or any information I give you. And as a brand, you need to say, right, well, if that's what a customer wants, how do I satisfy that in a way that's actually useful for my business? Well, it might be incredibly useful for my business to understand where a customer is, how close they are to my offices or my customers, what is the likelihood of their skills, how valuable are those skills to me, how hard are they to find, etc. So actually producing that personalization and asking for information and using metadata could be incredibly important. Likewise, using relevant imagery and content is often something that users are looking for to understand the business if it's one they want to work for. For example, we had a client where they were very type A people. They were really sort of, they were all sort of, volunteer firefighters at the weekend. So the type of imagery you show and the type of way you express yourself is really important in terms of the content used in the recruitment section. So, allowing a candidate to self-select themselves in or out will help improve the quality of job hires before they even get to an interview stage. Similarly, on save and return and prompting, being able to grab their contact details, etc. The specifics of the journey will change, but really just try and understand, well, what does the user need a customer has, and how do we as a brand want to respond to that, both in a way that satisfies that need, and also in a way and a solution that is also useful for the business. And what will commonly happen is to say, well, look, if this is the show we want to put on, if this is the journey we want to orchestrate, we'll think a lot about the backstage of that. Okay, so what does a technical architecture look like? And I've just drawn some boxes, don't overthink that, but in this sort of sense, you'll have a DAM there, content hub from Sitecore and marketing automation, etc., etc. Fine, all that's great. But really, what is the brand in this instance? It is content and data across paid and unearned media. In this sense, the brand, the tangible representation of the brand, is the content and the data. And really, for the user, it's content. The conversation we are mediating, that we are orchestrating, the conversational commerce, is not actually with the CEO, or it's not with a store attendant often, or not exclusively. It's not with a person on the end of a phone. It is often, and more often than not, it is content, often digital content. And so, how do we write content for each stage of that service design that we are building, content that is relevant to that person, but also the user need that we've specifically spent all this time researching. And it's extraordinary how often we don't really think about the different stage of the journey that customer's on. We know what we know from our user research, what that customer wants, and yet we don't tailor the content accordingly. So just as much as thinking about the personalization of their marketing content, we need to make sure we have content at each stage of that journey in order to facilitate and nudge people along that customer experience that we're attempting to orchestrate. Thirdly, the third sort of architectural view that will be included often when building a website is essentially brand architecture. So, often brand guidelines will impact the look and feel. Traditional above-the-line brand architecture will actually rely on something called brand archetypes, which were originally sort of influenced by the psychologist Jung. Neither here nor there, but essentially, it's sort of these sort of traditional brand archetypes that ask you to define the type of brand that you're trying to create. They'll say, are we the lover, the rebel, the explorer, the creator? Are we the sage, the magician, the jester, etc.? And however, that's great and has been particularly useful for decades now in helping a brand define who it is. The trouble is these brand archetypes are actually quite static things. They talk and are very useful for above the line advertising and not non-digital advertising. They are often they miss some of the interaction and behavior. And the reality about digital is that the magic is all in interaction. It's in the behaviors. Your brand needs to not just look a certain way, it needs to behave a certain way. When we use brand archetypes, we are essentially anthropomorphizing a brand, giving it a corporal human sense of who it is, and understanding, well, would this brand be my friend in real life? Would it be my colleague? How would it relate? And when you think about things like social media, you really need to say not just, well, what does my brand look like, but how would it react with its followers? How would it react to a PR problem? So I remember, and this just shows how old I am, but I remember the moment when I kind of really understood this. Maybe I was slow to grasp it, but about 7 or 8 years ago, during the Super Bowl, there was unexpected a power outage for about half an hour, and whilst that was going on, all of the sort of the Super Bowl adverts or whatever it might have been couldn't play. And yet, some brands really stole the show. So there was a lot of attention on Oreo, who had this incredible tweet. Even though the lights are only off for half an hour, in that time they had a team of content specialists who understood the brand, who understood the personality of the brand, understood how the brand would react at this time, and they put out a simple tweet, which probably took 5 minutes on Photoshop to make. And that tweet instantly got about 15,000 retweets during the actual Super Bowl, got about 20,000 Facebook likes. That was just during the actual event. If you think about that as both expressing the brand personality, but also expressing, it was just sort of the earned media value of that, that's huge. And you can't do that if your content people don't know the personality of the brand. So again, you can do this in different ways. We've got a one-day workshop, we do a horizontal, which sort of picks up on those static brand archetypes and says, okay, well, how do we move this into a digital world? What is the personality and behaviors of this brand, and how do we use that to influence the way we create content, whether it be social media content, whether it be the content on the site, whatever it might be? How do we allow content authors to understand who this brand is, who they are, to anthropomorphize them so they can write effectively, and to do that at scale? I think that's really important as a way that the brand can influence the content and the content can influence the brand. The fourth of these 5 architectural views that I want to touch on and how it's influenced by the personalization framework is just UX. So the user experience, the kind of the detail of how things are presented and flow. I mean, it astounds me how often content authors are forgotten, and how content becomes a question of, to the extent that it gets discussed as content migration, as lifting and shifting, as dragging and dropping, as it's not. Whereas actually, content authors for decades, for generations in newsrooms and anywhere the content's created have refined this process and have you traditionally entrust the content author to understand how something should be presented. And I don't see why that should be any different here, why they shouldn't influence the look and feel. So that leads to some obvious suggestions. So one of my personal hates, don't use lorem ipsum. If I see a website has lorem ipsum up until a day before go live, I know that the content authors, the people who have spent all that time understanding the brand archetype, spent all that time understanding the types of content that needs to be created, have had no say in the look and the feel of that site. So don't do that. Allow the content authors to play a role, and to actually guide what that site looks like. But also, don't forget the user flow. Sitecore has an incredible workflow functionality that allows, just like a newsroom or just like a printing press would allow, content authors and editors and approvals to happen instantaneously. And so, being able to use that and set that up, that structure is important. And of course, increasingly, the real game changer, I think, for content authors is Content Hub, which is one of the more recent products for Sitecore. I mean, yes, ostensibly a dam. I mean, but so much more than that. So much more than a dam. I mean, there was a recent McKinsey report that suggested that all marketers spend about 20% of their week looking for the right asset. So this is, looking through emails and Dropbox and, different products and platforms and then trying to figure out, well, okay, is this the most recent version or is there a version 4.324? And also then figuring out the IP rights. Am I legally allowed to use this piece of content in Japan as well as in Thailand, or can I only use it in Australia but not New Zealand? I mean, there's a lot of time wasted, and Content Hub is an attempt to solve that and to do that beautifully and seamlessly as part of Sitecore. And so, thinking about these types of products and these types of workflows are really vital to making sure that the user experience works. Not to mention just the efficiency savings for the content team. So the final architectural view that I want to talk about is to say another architecture that will often get strategized and planned and delivered early on in the project will be data architecture. And this is to say, how is data stored and used, and how does it flow? What is its meaning and its value? And I think this is really important because personalization is a matchmaking between an individual and the right piece of content for them. Really, the way that we identify that is through data. Data is really the algorithm or the way that we actually learn who that person is and the right piece of content for them. And as you can see on the end here, I mean, eventually in the years to come, all of that learning will probably be done by machines. And Sitecore is a leader in that. There's the Sitecore Cortex product, which allows you to extract all that raw data, put that in sort of Python or R or whatever that might be, and to sort of run your own algorithms if you've got a team of data scientists. And similarly, there's Sitecore AI, which are sort of more prepackaged algorithms that allow you to start to use that data in very meaningful ways and engage in machine learning. And Sitecore puts you on that path to AI, puts you on that path to machine learning. But most projects actually start not with machine learning, but with human learning, with marketeers learning. And you really need to think through as such when you are working on personalization, and you're working with what Sitecore call their engagement score, engagement value, is what are the things that can happen? What is the data that we can collect that will signify that a certain user is a certain type of persona and the type of content we should show them? And this could be many, many things. So this I just grabbed. There's hundreds of different versions of this triangle, and most Sitecore clients will know sort of the process of going through and saying, well, look, if we're doing account-based marketing and someone's geolocated in a certain building, then it's likely they come from a certain company. If they're coming in through a certain Facebook campaign with a certain type of messaging, they're probably interested in this type of content. If they are coming in from downtown Shanghai on an iPhone 11, that's probably a different type of user to someone using a feature phone in Bangalore. So we can start to sell off from the metadata, but also, of course, we can also use any of the kind of on site or in-app behaviors. So if someone clicks on a certain button, if someone downloads a certain form, if someone spends a lot of time on a certain page, if someone searches for certain search terms, all of that is data that we can use in real time to understand who that person is and what type of content we need to get to them. But I actively encourage the content guys, the person responsible for the content architect, to engage with the data guys and say, well, look, what data are we actually collecting? What is the meaning and value of that data for me when it comes to personalization? And also to explain to them the business challenge you have. Look, I'm trying to identify, when is this high net worth individual, or when is it a institutional investor? When is this a young individual versus an old individual? When is it someone who speaks Chinese, speaks Mandarin versus someone who speaks English? These are all things that the data scientists or whoever's responsible for data will be able to help you understand the data you've got that you can build into Sitecore's personalization engine, and indeed be able to come up with other ideas for data collection. And grabbing them from day one will allow that personalization to be so much stronger. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of the way your personalization architecture should influence and be influenced by those other views. So in conclusion, the three things we discussed are: content is just increasingly important to customer experience. And that means that we need to take more care and more attention of it. And if you really want to personalize content, you need to think about a content architecture, or what I've called a personalization architecture. And that personalization architecture can take many forms, just depending on your industry and your business and the scale of the project you have. But fundamentally, just like the different views of a building architecture should influence each other, that personalization architecture should inform the other views of the site and be informed by those other architectural views. And if you do that, then you will have a successful content strategy, and you will have a successful personalization program. So hopefully that makes some sense.
Well, thank you, George. That was fantastic. And I've got a few questions, if you don't mind answering them. One of them is on the personalization architecture, the content architecture that you talked about, and you referred to breaking down the silos and the importance of IT and marketing and the different teams involved in digital initiatives working together. So with all the brands that you've worked with across all of these markets, who have you seen in organizations owning that content or personalization architecture? Which team do they belong to, and who are that person's stakeholders?
Yeah, each business has its own unique entity, but by and large, a personalization architecture is, as I say, sort of someone who needs to have empathy for a user, an ability to structure the content to meet that user need. And overwhelmingly, that person is likely to be found within marketing and likely to be found in the content team, whatever that looks like. And of course, it can be different people because, as we've said, we need to break down silos. And for some reason, maybe that person exists elsewhere. Fundamentally, it needs to be someone who can hold up the conversation and represent content in that conversation with the technology guy, with the brand guy or girl, with the UX person, and with the data person. And so it needs to be someone who can respect content authoring, someone who can understand how to present content, and who can understand how to create the right content. So overwhelmingly, you want someone who is a content person. Usually, that exists in a marketing department, and it's usually someone of relative seniority who is comfortable interfacing with all the different parts of the business.
Okay. Is this person also the person who would be driving the usage of a tool like, or a platform like Content Hub within an organization?
Yeah, I think, I know I'm like a broken record to many people on this, but I really think Content Hub is a game changer, right? Like, I really think it's a huge opportunity. I mean, if you think about what Sitecore and has done, I mean, It has a number of products that are essentially around transforming the customer experience. From its origins as a content management system through to its commerce capabilities. I mean, even as commerce engine is an attempt to try and include transactional capabilities in a customer experience. And indeed, its AI and machine learning capabilities the same to understand the customer. Content Hub it isn't directly about transforming the customer experience. In my opinion, it's about transforming the marketing department.
All right. All right. Thank you. So just summarizing our webinar today, the success of your personalization strategy depends on how you design and build the underlying content framework and invest in an integrated platform that makes it easy for you to build, manage, and publish content to deliver that personalized experience. That brings us to the end of the webinar. If you have any questions for George or myself, please reach out to us on LinkedIn. As mentioned at the start, a recording of this webinar will be emailed to anyone who's registered for the webinar. If you're interested in finding out more about Sitecore, please email us at marketingasia@sitecore.com. And our next webinar will be in about a month, and we'll be sending out invites soon, so stay tuned. Thank you again, George, for the presentation today. And we look forward to seeing all of you at our next Sitecore webinar. Have a great day.